Hi everyone! I return with more Sennelier watercolor swatches, courtesy of Kim, who was kind enough to send all of these to me. This is the second batch of swatches from Sennelier, and you can see the first half by clicking the info card that should be popping up in the top right of this video. The whole playlist will also be linked there, as well as in the description box down below. Currently, I'm swatching Rose Madder Lake, created from the pigment PV19 Quinacridone Rose. It is a sort of middle-of-the-road hot pink. It's not quite cool or warm, but it is a tad more muted than what you would typically see from a Quinacridone Rose. The closest paint to Sennelier's Rose Madder Lake would actually be Daniel Smith's version of Quinacridone Rose. The Daniel Smith version has more deepness and is the slightest touch cooler. Meanwhile, I swatched Mgram's version in a past video and it is warmer than either of them, but I think it's closer in texture to Rose Madder Lake. Helios Purple is created from the pigment PR122 Quinacridone Magenta. This scan of the dried swatch is admittedly not the best. It does take a lot of the depth out of the color and it washes it out a fair bit. It is an even cooler toned pink than Rose Madder Lake, more of what I think fuchsia to be. This is a super pretty color, but unfortunately it's not very light fast, even though the pigment PR122 tends to be. As far as similar colors go, the only other paint in my collection made from PR122 is Daniel Smith's Quinacridone Lilac, which is similar, but it's more of a mauve and more subdued. Meanwhile, Da Vinci's Quinacridone Violet, which is more muted than the Mgram version I swatched in another video in this series, is not a great match, but it is sort of similar, so I figured it was worth comparing them. It's more of a purple than Helios's fuchsia. Dioxazine Purple is created from PV23 Dioxazine Purple, aka my favorite pigment ever. This is a very beautiful royal purple, cool-toned but still unmistakably violet. Sennelier lists theirs as being light fastness 3, which is really unfortunate because I actually really love this version. It's so vivid and it has all the depth of color that I love so much from a Dioxazine Purple. The most similar would be Daniel Smith's Carbazole Violet, which is so incredibly deep that it nearly looks black in the mass tone. The purple also feels less saturated, but I'll probably do a proper swatch test when I have finished all of the dot cards, just to be sure of how they compare on camera. Meanwhile, my previous favorite, Mgram's Dioxazine Purple, is certainly beautiful and purple, but it doesn't have that same depth as either Cinelli or Daniel Smith's versions. Cobalt Blue from the pigment PB28 or Cobalt Aluminium Oxide is listed as transparent, but it isn't really at all. If anything, this one is definitely closer to semi-transparent or even semi-opaque. It is a very primary blue, like a very Crayola blue crayon blue, but it doesn't have a lot of deepness. This one makes me think of the sky in summer. I did also swatch Daniel Smith's Cobalt Blue in another video, which is very, very, very similar. The scan swatches look more different, but to the eye in real life, the swatches are very alike. The opaqueness of Cobalt Blue does remind me of Sennelier's Cinereous Blue, which I swatched in the last Sennelier video, though it makes Cinereous Blue look very cyan in comparison. French Ultramarine Blue is a mix of PB29 Ultramarine Blue and PV15 Ultramarine Violet, which is curious because a lot of French ultramarines from brands like Winsor Newton or Daniel Smith are created solely with the PB29 pigment, and I can't really tell what the addition of PV15 adds. This is another primary blue, bolder and warmer toned than the Cobalt Blue. In my Daniel Smith swatches, I have their version of just plain ultramarine blue, which is perhaps the most similar. I don't have any French ultramarines in my collection to compare it to. French Ultramarine feels just the slightest touch cooler or more green in comparison. In my own personal collection, I have a Holbein's Ultramarine Deep, which is also very similar, but it is a tad cooler toned and it's also more muted. It's not quite as saturated. Phthalo Blue, created from PB15:3 Phthalocyanine blue pigment, is a beautiful deep blue on the cooler or more cyan side. It's what I prefer for a primary triad blue personally, alongside a really good Quin Rose and a cool yellow. I really love this version, though the scan really doesn't do it justice. I just realized I don't have many phthalo blues in my collection, which I clearly need to rectify because they are such a versatile color. I do have Amgram's version, which is not as muted as the scan swatch would imply. It really is a lot closer to the Sennelier version. I also have Shinhan PWC's version, which they call Peacock Blue. Our last paint, Quinacridone Gold, is a mix of 3 pigments: PR101, red iron oxide, PY150, nickel azomethane yellow, and PR206, Quinacridone maroon. I love Quin Golds in general. I love that coppery mass tone and how it dilutes into such a bright sunshiny yellow. Sennelier's is beautiful, but I tend to prefer paints with only 1 or 2 pigments, because otherwise I find your mixes can get muddy a lot quicker, which is probably just me being nitpicky. For comparison, I have Mgram's Nickel Quinacridone Gold, which is a 2-pigment mix and has just as much, if not more, depth than Sennelier's version. Though Sennelier's is smoother to lay down, I still think I prefer the Mgram version. I did also recently swatch Quinacridone Burnt Orange by Daniel Smith. PO48 is a pigment often used in Quin Gold hues to replicate the original Quinacridone Gold pigment, PO49, which has unfortunately been discontinued. I did this in my last video too, but I will also compare these paints to my Cinelli Petite Aquarelle palette, which contains 24 of the student grade versions of Cinellier's watercolor paints. There is a student grade rose madder lacquer that is very similar to the artist grade rose madder lake. Even straight to the transparency and the light fastness ratings. I would probably hazard to guess they may even be made with the same pigment, though La Petite doesn't offer any pigment listing information that I have ever been able to find. There is a cobalt blue hue in La Petite, which would likely mean it isn't created with the PB28 cobalt pigment. It feels much more faded and less deep than the artist grade version. It kind of makes me think of denim in comparison. French Ultramarine is, I guess, most similar to Ultramarine, though Ultramarine is much more subdued and it's also a touch more purple. And lastly, there isn't a named phthalo blue in La Petite, but they do have a color called primary blue that feels very similar. In fact, I would feel that it's probably very likely primary blue is created with the phthalo blue PB15:3 pigment, though it could be a mix of other pigments. Who knows? It's all a mystery. I hope you enjoyed this look at Cinelli Watercolors. Of course, if you have any questions or concerns, please let me know down below in the comments. I do love to help you out as best as I can, or really just to hear from you in general. If you haven't already, please subscribe and give this video a like if you enjoyed it. It helps me out a ton. Thank you so much for watching. Bye!